Good afternoon, everyone. This is Paul Keeley from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're going to give it a minute for lots of people to join. We've got a very large registration for this, so we'll give people about a minute or so to join the call. Thank you. We're going to give it another 30 seconds while people are still joining the call. Be with you in that amount of time. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Keeley. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. I want to welcome you all to today's national call on coronavirus, disasters, housing, and homelessness. As always, today's call has low-income residents and people with lived experience with homelessness, homeless shelter and services providers, affordable housing providers, and advocates from around the country, as well as members of the media, staff from congressional offices, and others. So, as you probably know, if you've been following the news, negotiations over a new coronavirus relief bill appear to be in their final hours, with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi setting a deadline of tomorrow to determine whether she and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin will be able to reach a deal before the election. Speaker Pelosi is insisting on $2.2 trillion. The latest White House proposal is at $1.8 trillion, but there are a number of significant policy differences that remain as well. Meanwhile, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announced the Senate would vote on a quote unquote targeted and wholly inadequate $500 billion relief package on Wednesday of this week, with no funding for emergency rental assistance, homelessness services, or any other housing assistance. We're going to hear more from NLIHC's VP for Public Policy, Sarah Sadian, on all this later in the call. In addition, on this call, we'll be discussing the new Marginalized Communities Briefs of the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 Homelessness Response. We'll be hearing about nonpartisan voter engagement efforts during the pandemic, NLIHC's tracking of state and local emergency rental assistance programs, and updates from the field. I just want to remind everybody, we did get some questions before the call began, and we'll try to get to those during the call. If you'd like to ask a question during the call, please enter it into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and use the chat function to communicate, share resources, or whatever. But do use the Q&A for questions and answers, and I'll pull from there. So this call, we're going to start with updates from the field, and I'd like to introduce Jonelle Willer from the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency to start us off. Jonelle?
All right, well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for asking me to be a part of today's call. My name is Jonelle Willer, and I am the Continuum of Care Coordinator for the state of North Dakota. North Dakota is not doing so well with COVID right now, so a couple of challenges that we faced in the state Back in March, our State Department of Human Services rolled out hotel sheltering across the state for individuals experiencing homelessness that either tested positive for COVID or were waiting test results. Our human service zones were the points of contacts in all 8 regions across the state. One of the biggest challenges of that situation was finding hotels to agree to take this on, but we were able to make it work where it was needed most. Security was provided at each of those hotels and meals were delivered to the individuals that were staying there. In July, the state actually stopped the management of the hotel sheltering and passed it to the local governments. The state, but they still helped with the match of the FEMA funds to an extent, and then the local governments needed to provide the rest of the match. And Department of Human Services has continued to work with those local communities to assist to set up their processes, and a plan has been developed in each region. We did have, the other challenge we faced was that a couple of shelters closed in March, either because they were a winter-only shelter or because of the social distancing guidelines, and there were no other shelters in those communities, so individuals were left on their own. One community did have a nonprofit step up, and they were placing people and families in hotels. And then another agency in that same community was trying to house as many people as possible by using their emergency solutions grant funds to pay deposits and the first month's rent. Now, one shelter has reopened since that time. However, they're currently full. So we're back in that same situation in that community. And then the other is opening on November 1st again for the winter season. Another shelter that closed still hasn't opened, and they're not sure that they will be. So again, all of those individuals are being left out on their own to kind of figure out where they're going to go, where they're going to stay. At the COC level, we put a temporary prioritization policy in place that allowed agencies to bypass the prioritization list that we have in place for our coordinated entry and house individuals as quickly as possible. So that policy has been extended through the end of the year. We also added questions to our homeless management information system relating to COVID. So I receive a weekly report from our HMIS lead. However, the numbers are not necessarily reflective of the actual data, since many of our agencies across the state are either not currently using HMIS, including the human service zones that were referring people to the hotels in March through July. So our positive numbers for individuals experiencing homelessness have been considerably low, at around 60 testing positive across the state. And those are the numbers, again, that are in our HMIS system. That number also does not include the domestic violence shelters across the state, where we know that 2 shelters experienced at least 1 case and had to move everybody to hotels. However, I was able to get a count from our Department of Human Services. They had over 200 individuals use the shelters. Again, that number, though, does not necessarily mean that people had tested positive for COVID. What it does mean is that they were either quarantined or isolated waiting for test results, or they were positive. So even with those numbers, considering the number of cases in North Dakota as a whole, it's significantly low. And I credit a lot of that to the agencies that work across our state to ensure that the individuals that they serve are being kept safe. One other thing that North Dakota did was implement an emergency rent bridge that can provide temporary rental assistance to eligible renters who are experiencing a loss of household income due to COVID. They must be experiencing an economic hardship due to COVID after March 15th, have a lease with limited resources, and then they also must meet the income limits. So the income is restricted to households with income at or below the 60% of the area median income, adjusted for household size and the county of residence. And it also includes both earned and unearned income, including unemployment benefits received. As of today, we have served 3,590 households have actually applied. 931 households have received one or more payments. 377 households were denied. We have 532 applications in progress. Households that applied but have not followed up with information or responded to contact efforts is at 1,745, and then 2,667 payments have been made in the amount of $1.6 million. Now, this money will carry out with the CARES funding through the end of the year, and then the CDBG COVID funding will be available for the emergency rent bridge after the first of the year. So with that, if there's any additional questions, I am available, or you can contact me at that email address that's on the slide as well. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Chanel. And boy, really looking at the current state of affairs with COVID generally across North Dakota, where cases are just skyrocketing per 100,000, one of the highest in the country, if not the highest. It's amazing that your positivity numbers for the homeless population have remained low. So congratulations to all the agencies that are serving that population. That's really great.
Yeah, thank you.
So we do have a couple of questions in here. Did the state punting to localities match the Trump administration punting to states for COVID catastrophic housing impact? And how does this Republican localizing strategy serve those most in need?
So I don't have the answer to that question right off the bat, but if you email it to me, I can certainly get it for you.
Okay. Another question here is just what's the name of the emergency relief fund?
It's called the Emergency Rent Bridge, and it's run out of our Department of Human Services.
Okay. And then Jerry just says, seems like many people are not being served. Am I correct? I guess he means by the emergency rent bridge so far.
Yeah, and so there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, they have to meet that income level. There's a number of individuals that have not followed up with information or responded to the contact efforts from the Department of Human Services. And then the other part of this emergency rent bridge is that the landlords have to sign up as a recipient in our Office of Management and Budget process system. And so if the landlords don't sign up, we can't make that payment, the state can't make that payment to them. It's been a sore spot for me. I'm not really sure how they're handling it, but they are working through that process.
Okay, there is another question here saying people in Minneapolis can't use that assistance. I'm assuming they need to be from North Dakota.
Correct.
Each state will have its own programs. Did I hear you correct in terms of the emergency rent bridge originally being funded with CRF resources, and then CDBG CV will kick in after that?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And is there a total amount that's been allocated?
I don't have that dollar amount. They didn't send it to me this morning. I know when they originally rolled it out, they expected it to completely be used up by August, and that wasn't the case, fortunately. So the total dollar amount I could probably find for you rather quickly, though.
That's okay. I was just curious if you had that at hand. But 1.6 million, is that correct, has been allocated so far?
Has been spent to date, yep.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much, Chanel. I think that's it for the questions. We really appreciate you sharing that update from a very, very hot spot these days, North Dakota. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we will move on now to the great state of Florida, and we'll hear from Gladys Cook from the Florida Housing Coalition. Gladys, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to give you a brief update from Hurricane Sally, which came to Florida's Panhandle on September 16th. It was somewhere between a category 2 and 3. It had very high rain and it was very slow storm. So that meant it sat on top of the Pensacola area for over a day. So there was a lot of flooding. So most of the major damages from flooding. There was also a lot of roof damage. The shelters that opened did not have many occupants and they're all closed now. Then on October 2nd, FEMA approved individual assistance for 5 counties. There's actually 13 counties that were involved, and those are the ones that get the public assistance, but there are 5 counties that got the individual assistance. And so far, there's been just about 24,000 registrations in those 5 counties that have been approved for individual assistance. About 18,000 of those are in Escambia County, which is where Pensacola is. And Pensacola is home to the Naval Air Station at Pensacola. And the biggest impact there was that the Pensacola Bay Bridge was hit with some barges that broke free. And so that bridge won't be rebuilt for at least 6 months. So it's creating 1.5 hour commutes for people going back and forth to the Naval Air Station. There's talk of a ferry being started up, but that's one of the big issues with that one. No one has approved immediate disaster case management yet through FEMA. They might be applying for disaster case management, but at the moment we have FEMA-based disaster case management still operating in Bay County and several of the counties around there. And those case managers have reached out to the folks in Pensacola and offered to assist them with initial case management and to help people file insurance claims. The Florida Office of Insurance thinks there's about $300 million in insurable claims that would happen. We had some reports from Florida Housing Finance Corporation, and they have quite a large portfolio of properties. There's about 14 properties with 1,600 units in the 5 counties that had damage. It's all listed as limited or roof, some flooding. The most spectacular case is a HUD Section 8, project-based Section 8 property. It's privately owned. It's called Forest Creek. And it had 200 units. All of the ground floor units are uninhabitable. It's about 74 families are displaced. And those families have been reaching out to, for example, the city of Pensacola, who is helping them find housing. This property has repetitive flooding. It was approved for buyout 4 years ago. There's 1 more year left on that initial grant to negotiate. And they had stopped negotiating because the property owner wanted more than the appraised value. And now they're saying, well, maybe we'll talk. But in any case, that property is just a good example for all of us about what happens when you build in the floodplain and then you keep having these repetitive damage events. And there's 74 families now that don't have housing. Kind of on the light side, they call it Blue Angel Boulevard because that's where the Navy's Blue Angels performing pilots are based, and they've renamed it Blue Tarp Boulevard because there's so many blue tarps. But that's kind of the scenario. It wasn't devastating except for the people who lost their homes to flooding, but it wasn't that widespread. And so our housing ship administrators with the state housing trust funds, they're gearing up to be able to help people with fixing their roofs and the tarps. And then probably most of the flooding will be going through NFIP because so many were actually not insured. Even that HUD property mysteriously was not insured. And I'll just end that the Escambia Long-Term Recovery Group formed on October 7th. And so they're going to be meeting regularly to work with all of the different resources. Volunteer Florida is in there, and Escambia County Emergency Management, and even the Florida Housing Coalition will be serving on one of their teams, the construction team. And that's all being organized and hosted by Be Ready Alliance, Coordinating for Emergencies Brace, which is it's kind of a mitigation and safe home type organization. So take any questions you might have.
Great, Gladys, thank you so much. Yeah, a couple of questions from Jerry. Do you have estimates of the number in emergency need and when they might be served? And it's kind of a couple parts question I'm going to share with you. How many other Section 8 housing needs are there in your region? And then do you know the number of blue tarp homes and rental units in the area, and how did the insurance gap develop?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I don't have specific numbers for you yet. They're still doing some of the damage assessments. There were several other HUD properties that were damaged, and I don't have the numbers for you. There were about 15 residents in housing choice voucher homes, and all of those people are being assisted with rental assistance from the city of Pensacola. And what was the last question? The blue tarps number.
Yeah.
One example is Santa Rosa County asked for 300. So it's pretty extensive within the 5 counties. But I don't have any full numbers yet. I don't want to, put total numbers of damaged out yet.
Right.
I just don't have that.
Right. Okay, I think there aren't any other questions. Let me just check over here. Well, there is in the chat, when first floor apartments are flooded, many or most of these tenants have disabilities. How are they being helped regarding their disabilities? That would be good to know.
Yeah, the Center for Independent Living in Escambia County has been taking in all of those requests. And so they're working with people to get them temporary housing and to get whatever their needs are for assistance, for accessibility. But yeah, that has been quite an issue. And, but the Center for Independent Living is
right. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Gladys, for that update. Okay. And we may be circling back with you in the future to hear more. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm just getting most of the hard numbers in, so I'll definitely update everybody.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Let me just see here. Okay. All right, we're going to move now to Massachusetts, and we have Eric Shupin from the Citizens Housing and Planning Association of Massachusetts. Eric.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me, and thanks to NLIHC for all the great work that you're doing in Washington, D.C. We appreciate it very much. So again, I'm Eric Shupin. I'm the Director of Public Policy of CHAPA, and we're a statewide affordable housing advocacy organization that advocates for increasing access to affordable housing in Massachusetts. In terms of updates that I have on what we've been doing in response to COVID when it comes to housing, this past weekend, actually, on the 17th, our state eviction moratorium ended. We had an eviction moratorium that was one of the strongest in the nation that banned all stages of evictions for almost every evictions. And it's something that CHAPA helped support passing as well as defending in court. But that moratorium gave the governor the discretion to extend or not extend the moratorium. He had extended it earlier this summer for a period of time, but again, on Saturday, he chose not to extend the moratorium. Leading up to Saturday, advocates in Massachusetts, and certainly including CHAPA, had focused on securing resources, securing eviction prevention resources, as well as other efforts around passing new legislation to extend protections like our state moratorium, and I'll talk about both of those. For eviction prevention resources, the governor announced when he said last week that he would not be extending the moratorium, he did announce an eviction diversion initiative that was a welcome announcement. And this was a commitment of $171 million from various state and federal funds, including CARES Act funds and funds from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, for a variety of different resources and programs. First, the governor announced that $100 million would be committed for emergency rental assistance. And this is a program in Massachusetts that existed before COVID, but as COVID has unfolded, we've certainly advocated for more resources for it. This program provides up to $10,000 in assistance for housing costs in order to stabilize a tenancy, stabilize a household for the next 6 months, or if there are children in that household would be stabilized through the end of June, which would get them through the school year. So again, that's a welcome boost of funding for our emergency rental assistance program. The initiative also included $49 million committed for rapid rehousing for those who are at risk of homelessness and to divert them from shelter, as well as $12 million for legal assistance for low-income tenants facing eviction in court. They're also expanding pre-court mediation services so that hopefully as many eviction cases as possible can be prevented from ever reaching court and having it worked out between the tenant and the owner. All of these resources, I said, are very welcome, and CHAPA had been advocating for the governor to make these resources available, but there are two main concerns. First, it's just simply not enough money. That's a plug certainly for anybody listening from Congress. We need you to act, and we need more resources, certainly. And also in the state level, in Massachusetts, it's predicted that we need $40 million per month in emergency rental assistance just to keep up with the demand. And we know that $100 million will only last for so long. The second concern is that with the state moratorium lifting, and we know that we have the federal moratorium through the end of the year, but the Massachusetts state moratorium provided stronger protections for residents in Massachusetts. And so there are concerns about, one, what that's going to mean for cases moving forward now, as well as what it will mean for residents who now have to work to access the federal protections under the federal moratorium. Before COVID, there were 10,000 eviction cases already pending in the Massachusetts courts. The state moratorium stopped those evictions, but with the ending of our state moratorium, all of those eviction cases can start moving forward today. Monday is the first day since March that our housing court has fully reopened and is going to be moving cases forward. So there's certainly been renewed focus on getting the word out about the federal protections and the resources that are available that I just talked about, but then securing additional protections at the state level that the legislature might be able to pass. That legislation, I can give an update on what that's providing for. Again, advocates have been focused on passing new statutory protections that where emergency rental assistance or the courts alone can't protect against that displacement. That's where these statutory protections are looking to come in and step in. And this includes extending the state moratorium for at least another year, as well as providing resources for landlords and other protections against foreclosure and forbearance. Again, all in the hopes of preventing as much displacement as we can. The question is, for Massachusetts, what is our legislature going to do? And we are, we're wondering that ourselves. The pressure is building to act, but we're still waiting first and foremost to pass a state budget and get through some other things. And so we're hopeful that the legislature will return and take up some of these matters, as well as the governor continuing to make good on his commitment of all these resources, as well as getting these programs up and running as quickly as possible. I mentioned that there was funding being made available for legal assistance, as well as for pre-court mediation services, all very good things. However, it's going to take weeks, if not months, to put those programs in place and get them up and running. And in the meantime, court cases are moving forward. So there's that concern where, yes, it was very welcome that the governor made a commitment of those resources and those programs. But evictions start moving forward today, and there's the concern of what's going to happen. So we're going to be watching how many evictions are filed. Mentioned there were 10,000 evictions already in the court system, and now we'll be waiting to see how many will be moving forward. And estimates have been upwards of 60,000 evictions might be filed through the end of this year based on people impacted by COVID. We'll also be looking at how quickly we go through these resources, because again, I said $100 million, that's a good amount of money. And but again, it probably won't even cover all of the need that currently exists. So with that, I think I'll pause and see if there are any questions. But again, wanted to say thank you, and thanks for all the work that everybody's doing on these calls to protect residents at this time.
Thanks so much, Eric, for that very detailed report, and it is outstanding what Massachusetts has done so far and is continuing to do. Just a quick question about the emergency rental assistance. Can you tell us anything about how it's being targeted? You say that it's obviously not enough. Are they targeting to a certain percentage of AMI? Any other details about the emergency rental assistance you can share with us?
Sure. So the emergency rental assistance of up to $10,000 is being targeted at those households with an income of 50% or less of the area median income. So that's the income eligibility. The other requirement is that in order to qualify for the $10,000 payment, that household had to be financially impacted by COVID. So that's the other requirement. We do have in Massachusetts other resources that reach different income levels for emergency rental assistance. We have something called our Emergency Mortgage and Rental Assistance Program, IRMA, and that reaches households at 50 to 80% of the area median income. But that doesn't provide up to $10,000. That only provides up to $4,000. But we still think that it's good that there are some resources available for households from at 80% and below of the area median income.
Great. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A box here. One is, where does the 40 million per month figure come from?
That figure, sure. That figure came from a report published by a regional planning agency here in Massachusetts called the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC. And this is an organization that provides assistance to municipalities in planning on transportation and housing, and does research and gathers a lot of data. So MAPC is where that number came from. Okay.
And then another question from Maureen Howard was, is this CRF money that's being used for the, go ahead.
Sure, some of it is. So we are still trying to, because the announcement was made last week, and we've been trying to find out more details on exactly what funds are coming from where. But it's been, the governor said that it would be a combination of coronavirus relief funds, other CARES Act funds that Massachusetts controls, as well as state appropriations, so state monies. So a combination of those three.
Okay. Laura Massey has a note here that from the Massachusetts Legal Services, we have concerns about tenant protections and availability of legal advice for tenants in pre-court mediation. Also of concern is the extremely slow processing of emergency rental assistance and few due process protections. These programs are not necessarily working on the same time front. I just lost it. On the same time frame as court process.
That's exactly right. And Laura's an outstanding advocate here in Massachusetts, and we absolutely need to work on processing times for these applications, and that's something that I know that the organizations that administer these resources are working to make that process easier, to get the word out about these resources. A lot of people may not even know, and that's we need to get the word out. If anybody's calling in from Massachusetts and you're wondering about these resources, you can call 211 to find out about them. And then we also know that the due process protections and the timing of when all these things happen may not always line up. And that's why I think there's been such a strong call for additional statutory protections to be put into place to offer protections against displacement where those either resources or the core process system can't protect those residents.
Okay, Eric, that was really great. Thank you so much. There are a few comments and questions still coming in. If you have a moment to stay with us and maybe respond to some of those in the chat or the Q&A box, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to move on now. Those are our field updates. Now we're going to, hopefully, Sarah Hunter is with us. Sarah, are you on?
I am. I just jumped on. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. All right. So Sarah Hunter from the National Innovation Service is going to talk a little bit about the framework for an equitable COVID-19 homelessness response, Marginal Communities Briefs. So Sarah, take it away.
Hey, that's great. Do you have slides for me? Can you go to the next one? Yeah, great. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to tell you about some documents that we just released as part of the broader framework for an equitable COVID-19 response. This is part of a larger effort that is a group of folks, including NLIHC and others, to put out some materials to help communities respond equitably to COVID-19. You've probably seen some of those documents that have come out on the NLIHC websites and so on. What I just want to tell you a little bit about what we did. We convened a group of folks who had experienced homelessness or housing instability during COVID-19 to have a series of discussions about what the response looked like for them, what their experiences were, and what their suggestions were for what our systems across the country ought to be doing differently. We basically had a series of focus groups with various marginalized communities to talk about what those things looked like. So we did that over the summer, early summer, and then we put all of that information together in a series of documents to explain sort of what folks were telling us and also what they thought we should be doing differently. So if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. And I'll just say that that picture of Mark Dones, our director at NIS, is because there's a video embedded on the website. So Mark explains sort of what we've done. So if you want a quick version of all of this in 10 minutes or less, and video is a better format for you, you can head over to that website and check out that video. So these are all the populations of folks that we had focus groups with, folks identified into these groups, and we asked a series of questions around what was working and not working, what the experiences were with services and housing supports, and what their recommendations were for things to be done differently. You can see each of these marginalized populations, each of these subgroups of folks. We did a separate brief on sort of everything that came out of that, and it's organized into sort of categories of how of what their experiences were around sort of the places that they were staying, the people they were interacting with, the system itself, and just some other sort of priorities. And so each of the groups listed here has their own brief and a document about what their sort of recommendations were. And then the next slide here is, I think, one that you can see where we talk about what the themes were actually across all of the groups. So I just want to highlight what those themes are real quick. The first one was, look, the crisis response that we have right now with large congregate shelters not only doesn't work in COVID-19, but it doesn't work at all for us. And we want something different. We want a different kind of crisis response. And so these briefs sort of recommend that we shift the sector to that different type of crisis response away from congregate shelter. The second big policy shift is to actually have services that are dignity-based and are led by people who are closest to experiences of homelessness within these communities. And you hear that coming out of particularly Native, Pacific Islander, Asian American, LGBT trans-specific communities, like, hey, we want to design the services for us. That's how we ought to be having services provided, and we need to figure out how to fund that, and that they ought to be based in dignity. So that was a theme that occurred across all of the focus groups that we conducted. The third was obviously a question of supply of affordable housing, and that there isn't enough, and that it ought to be dedicated to folks who have historically faced challenges in getting in housing. And then the fourth is sort of the bigger one here, that sort of was part of the moment, and also I think a theme that's emerging out of lots of conversations, not one that we had heard quite resonate so directly, but is obviously one that is very important, is to get policing out of the homelessness response system, and then reinvest the money that is spent there into the other sort of three policy shifts that we talked about. So those are the big the themes that came out of the focus groups. We're hoping that these themes have sort of a long life and can help shift conversations both locally about what homeless response looks like, and then more broadly nationally, and sort of broader efforts. So I'll stop there. I think maybe folks have some questions. I see there's some Q&A coming in.
Fantastic, outstanding. Thank you so much, Sarah. Just curious, were there any sort of surprising differences between the different focus groups?
Surprising differences between them. No, I mean, I would say that they were actually like the bigger thing. I mean, it was pretty consistent that like the systems aren't organized to focus on us. You know, most folks came with like the way we're interacting with systems, the way people interact with us and the system interacts with us feels like it's for somebody else. So, you know, who that someone else is depended on what the group was, but that was a theme that was really across everything that folks said. I mean, to some degree, I think for some groups, there was the ability to articulate some things that were working well, where other groups sort of didn't have anything to say about anything that worked well. So I think that is a thing to be paying attention to across the different populations too. One of the things that I think, one of the reasons why we didn't just do the sort of the one document that did the themes, and something to be paying attention to in the documents themselves, is because, I mean, I think you could probably articulate the obvious reasons here, but, across the country and in different pockets of places where you might be responding, it might be interesting to see very specifically what the recommendations were based on sort of who is in, who's getting disproportionately, who's facing homelessness disproportionately in your community, or even, neighborhood to neighborhood, what responses ought to be looking like, and how to sort of structure a response that is appropriate based on who your who the populations actually are in your community.
It's so important. Thank you. So we do have a few questions in here that we'll get to, at least some of them. Do you have organizing strategies and tactics to build a stronger grassroots movement? Is one of the questions.
I mean, I have some strategies and tactics. That wasn't something that came necessarily out of these documents. I think one of the things that I can say broadly is that the approach where we are making intentional efforts to include and not just sort of, I mean, this was a process of doing sort of focus groups for the intent of sort of producing these documents and being able to say something, but there's a lot of that's replicable in local communities. And part of the beginning of organizing is having conversations that look something like this, right? Like just some simple gathering and fact finding, and like really listening to folks and their experiences. I think the second part of it is, and what we usually do as a sector, I think, is we say, oh, that's a great idea, but we can't do it, so I'm just going to put it over here or table it. What these documents don't do is they don't sort of hedge what folks recommended into things that we think are easier to accomplish or easier to do. These are very difficult things to actually get done. And I think that lends to sort of credibility. When it comes to organizing, I think that is a very foundational piece of why folks would come together and sort of build a like small d democratic effort to really try to shift sort of decision making and power and things like that locally, which is sort of the goal of organizing, right? And if you can sort of if you can create an environment where there's trust and credibility, then the potential for having those organizing shifts actually take root and take place, and maybe even join with other efforts like those that are out there right now around defunding police or whatever, sort of build momentum and build decision making differently.
Great. There were a couple of comments about this shifting from police to services, one just commending it. And there's a question in here that if you have time, maybe you could get back to about just a little bit more information about police presence. There was a question also about the focus groups and the geographic diversity. Were the focus groups geographically diverse?
Yeah, so folks were recruited sort of based on we actually put together a group of sort of city, county, state, and provider groups as a network across the country, and then reached out to folks experiencing homelessness through that network. And that group sort of built the group of folks who we actually talked to. And so there's representation from Alaska to Florida, and sort of not everywhere in between, but there's a good geographic representation across the country in each of those groups. And if you go to the site, you can read more about sort of how the document was created and who was included, what the methodology was. And just to the I think the broader police question that you were asking, I see some of the comments. I mean, I think if you go to the specific briefs themselves, you can see like folks are in different populations or different groups are saying, look, like with some of the briefs are saying, I've never had a positive experience with the police. I've never had and so I don't want them anywhere near my services. There are a couple of briefs where you have a couple of folks saying, there was this thing that worked, but on the whole, like it's not worth it. So that's sort of, I think, the spectrum that we got to. There certainly wasn't anyone in any of the focus groups that were like, I benefited wholly from the police having interactions with me while I was living outside.
Sarah, thank you so much for this presentation and conversation and for addressing those questions. Again, there are a few more. If you have time to involve in the Q&A or the chat, that would be great. But thank you so much for that presentation. Really appreciate it and appreciate the work that you're doing.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, we're going to move on in our agenda. So we'll bring up, okay. So we have our very own Joey Lindstrom, Director of Field Organizing at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, who's going to talk a little bit about nonpartisan voter engagement efforts during COVID-19. Joey?
Hey, thanks, Paul. And thank you all for being on this call and for the work that you're doing in communities throughout the country on behalf of low-income renters and people experiencing homelessness. I don't believe I have control of these slides, so I think I'm just going to say next slide to May or Kim, who's running this. All right, and next slide again. Thank you. So NLIHC has been engaged on the elections for 2020 really for some time now. Over the last 18 months, we've engaged in a robust engagement of candidates and engagement of housing organizations and advocates throughout our network. Some of you might have seen that in 2019, we were very successful getting candidates for president to announce their plans to address housing challenges and to address homelessness, and to actually have questions about housing asked in the presidential debates. So we're really proud of that candidate engagement. But we've also been encouraging nonprofit organizations, housing providers, and housing advocates to be engaged in the three-pronged aspect of voter engagement. This is voter registration, which in many states has now passed, voter education, which is educating voters on what they need to bring with them, how to vote successfully, what the rules are for voting by mail, but then also educating them on how candidates stand on issues that relate to their concerns. But then finally, and most urgently right now, is voter mobilization, getting out the vote, making sure that people are early voting, submitting their ballots by mail, or voting safely on election day. Next slide. So we do this for a couple of really obvious reasons. One is we see a disparity in voter turnout rates between renters and homeowners. And as you see on the slide here, this disparity is pretty consistent, about 20%, about 20% difference in turnout between renters and homeowners. Next slide. And that disparity is actually even greater when you look at it not by renter versus homeowner, but by low income versus high income. What you see here is for households under 20,000 versus households over 100,000. High income people are voting at much, much higher rates. So it should be no surprise to us then that the policy preferences of elected officials favor high income homeowners versus low income renters. So addressing this disparity is really the goal of the Our Homes, Our Votes effort. We know that we have a lot of support in this concept because 83% of the public agrees that elected officials are not paying enough attention to the high cost of housing, and more than 3/4 of all people surveyed say that they're more likely to vote for a candidate who has a detailed plan for making housing more affordable. Next slide. So we've engaged our network throughout the country in a bunch of different ways. One of the things we've done is we've encouraged organizations to join the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign as an affiliate member. And an Our Homes, Our Votes affiliate is new for us because in the past, what we've done is we've made some helpful information available. We've made some tools available and some webinar trainings, but we never really knew who was using all of that information. As an affiliate, we get a chance to know, okay, who's actually doing work at the local level? Who can we follow up with? And who can we make sure has everything that they need to conduct the voter engagement campaign that they envision in their community? So people who join as affiliates get, t-shirts and posters and so forth. And actually, I've got a few packets remaining that I can send out. If any of you want to go to the website and sign up to be an affiliate today, you can get yourself some t-shirts and stickers and so forth. But we also give people access to the branded materials and logos and assistance from NLIHC staff. Next slide. Another new initiative this year has been the Housing Providers Council, where we have more than, at this point, 600,000 subsidized housing units covered by owners and operators of affordable housing who are participating in this coalition. These are all organizations that are committed to being nonpartisan in their efforts. They also engage their residents to help them overcome barriers to voting. Next slide. So we have various communications platforms where we share about Our Homes, Our Votes and the efforts that we're undertaking on the election. I think many of you saw the most recent tenant talk that hit mailboxes at the end of last month. And we also have the Our Homes, Our Votes, hashtag Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 hashtag that we use on Twitter. And we also have the Our Homes, Our Votes media toolkit that we've made available for organizations helping getting the word out. Next slide. But perhaps most interesting to many of you is that we have a lot of different template materials. And this is an example of, I am a renter and I vote. This is the name of the polling location and it's open from what blank time to blank time. There's a little box in the upper right-hand corner where an organization can drop in their logo and then submit to a printer. We have a lot of fillable templates and usable tools like this that folks might find helpful. Next slide. And in addition to that, we also have state merged materials where we put in information relevant to a given state. This is an example from Michigan. And many of these merged materials have places where a QR code for voter registration or requesting mail-in ballots can be inserted. Next slide. And then I finally really want to emphasize that election day is coming up and a lot of people are voting early. And we really need to make sure that low-income people in our networks are aware of the voter protection hotline, which I put up on the screen. That's 866-OUR-VOTE. All voters should contact the voter protection hotline, which is staffed by volunteer attorneys and other professionals, to make sure that if they face any kind of voter intimidation or harassment, if they see any violence at a polling place, if they see voter misinformation, if they're being denied a ballot, they should call this number and pursue an immediate intervention. All voters should remember that once they are in line, they should stay in line, because if they're in line by the time polls close, they must be provided with an opportunity to vote. And voters should cast provisional ballots if for some reason they're not being given a regular ballot. And then finally, I want to let you know where you can go for more information. That's just our website right here, ourhomes-ourvotes.org, and that's the hashtag, ourhomes-ourvotes2020. Going to the website or following the hashtag, you will see lots of information, lots of resources and materials. It's not too late to get involved. The most impactful election organizing to get out the vote is just talking to people you know, whether that's neighbors in a building you live in, or renters in a building you work in, or people who are homeless who visit a shelter where you are staff or a volunteer. Talking to people about the importance of the election is crucial, and you can get all the information you need about how to vote successfully at ourhomes-ourvotes.org. And we hope that many of you will take a look at the resources that we've worked hard to put together, because we really do want to close that gap of voter turnout rates between renters and homeowners. We want to close the gap for low-income people and high-income people. We want to demonstrate that renters are an informed and active voting bloc, so that elected officials will know that their interests matter in policy conversations. So that's all I wanted to share for today, Paul. I don't think I went over my time, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks so much, Joey. That was fantastic. I will just say that some of the questions were, will we share the slides? The answer is yes. We'll provide the link. Yes, Joey just provided the link. There was a comment here about seeking out 2020 uncommitted, I think it was the word, voters, when so many seem more committed than ever. Just to really reemphasize, we're not in this at all for any partisan reasons. Joey, use the word nonpartisan. This has to be, and all of our efforts are nonpartisan. So I just really want to emphasize that. There was a question about any tips on how to talk with candidates, get them to prioritize housing issues. Joe, I don't know if you want to take a crack at that.
Sure. I mean, I think the best way to get candidates to prioritize housing issues is by putting them in front of voters who want them to prioritize housing issues. This is obviously harder during a pandemic where we want to have fewer and fewer in-person events and so forth. But as you think about future engagements in person, or even current engagements that can be done virtually, think about, if you work in affordable housing communities, how can you invite candidates to meet your residents? Or how can you invite candidates to meet with people at the community center where you work or volunteer and so forth? The best way to get them to emphasize the importance of housing is to give them more exposure to the issue. It's certainly true, even in our presidential engagement, that we got a lot more traction with presidential candidates after they did, for example, with Secretary Castro, a tour of Skid Row in Los Angeles, or with Senator Kamala Harris, a tour of a mobile home park in Iowa and so forth, or even when William Weld met with housing providers in New Hampshire. Giving them greater familiarity with the issue will definitely make them more apt to increase it on their list of priorities. And this is a place where the housing movement, I think, has a lot of room to grow, because so many of us can make such a strong and compelling case for the need for housing solutions, but we're not often enough making that case to elected officials while they are candidates, because that's a really impactful moment to shape what they will publicly state is a priority for them. So I'd say putting them in front of low-income people, helping them see the programs, see the housing that is developed through housing subsidies will better inform their perspective and create a greater sense of urgency as they think about solutions.
I would just add to that, we got a lot of advice about this from our members of Congress. Whatever you can do to get local media, your local newspaper, your local, television, whatever, cover stories on affordable housing. Your local politicians pay attention to that. So that would be another thing to urge. Joey, can you just repeat the voter protection phone number? Another person asked that question.
Yes, it is 1-866-OUR-VOTE.
Fantastic. Okay, there are a few other questions in there, Joey, if you want to turn your attention to some of those while you're still on the call.
Sure.
Thanks a million. All right, let's move on to our next topic. So we have two members of the NLIHC team who are going to talk to us a little bit about emergency rental assistance programs and the work that we're doing at NLIHC to track them around the country. So Andrew Orend and Rebecca Ye, take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So this is Andrew. In late spring, a few months ago, NLIHC started to track rental assistance programs that had been created or expanded by either states or local governments in response to COVID-19. And we continue to track these programs because, of course, as we all know, they're so important to keeping renters stably housed during this crisis. We learn of these programs through a variety of ways, through the media, through press releases, from social media, from our state partners, and from a variety of other organizations who keep us alerted to these programs. Once we learn about a program, we collect as much information as we can about them. Information, I'll mention, that's readily available, either on public websites or within their application materials. And to date, we've identified more than 400 rental assistance programs, both state and local, that have been created or expanded in response to COVID-19. We have on our website at nlihc.org/rental-assistance an interactive map and an interactive table that identifies both the location of these programs as well as contact information for each of those programs. And then we also have more detailed information online, like who the programs serve, how much assistance an applicant can receive, the duration of assistance, and other information like that. And if you go to our website, you'll find a link that will take you to that much more detailed file. We're talking about this today because we plan to release a research note later this week that summarizes these programs and some of the lessons that we're starting to learn from them. And in a couple of minutes, Rebecca will talk about the findings that are going to be in the research note. I just want to first, though, mention that we continue to update this rental assistance programs database every week. And so this information is constantly evolving, and we will continue to produce updates as time goes on. We'll update this week's report as information changes. And I also want to mention that this database and this tracking is one piece of the work that we're doing to learn more about emergency rental assistance programs. One of the other things that we're currently doing is we're partnering with the Housing Initiative at the University of Pennsylvania and with NYU's Furman Center to survey administrators of these rental assistance programs to learn directly from them more about the successes they've had as well as the challenges that they've been facing in trying to implement these programs. That survey has been ongoing now for, I think it's been a little more than a month. We don't yet have the results. We're still collecting surveys, but we should have more detailed results from those in a couple of weeks. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, and she can talk about this week's research note.
Thanks, Andrew. This is Rebecca. So I'll just cover a couple of our key findings. As of October 7th, so a little over a week ago, we were tracking 414 programs across 41 states and 305 localities. Oh, there we go. Okay. And we're tracking approximately $3.6 billion. Most of this has come from CARES Act funding, which may include supplemental community development block grants, some supplemental emergency solutions grants, or the coronavirus relief fund. Programs funded exclusively by the CARES Act here in the bright blue represents approximately $2.8 billion, most of which is coming from coronavirus relief funds and the supplemental CDBG. States are typically using coronavirus relief funds, many for their statewide rental assistance programs, and in contrast, local jurisdictions are tending to use supplemental CDBG. There is a lot of variety in these programs, but most programs ask households to demonstrate COVID-related hardship, income eligibility of some sort, and proof of residency within the jurisdiction. But, we're really seeing that current income targeting is inadequate, and for programs using area median income ranged from 30% AMI up to 200% AMI. Of programs using area median income as part of their income targeting, only 3% targeted extremely low-income renters at 30% AMI or below. And these programs only have around $80 million of funding. 5 additional programs with approximately $109 million of funding either prioritize extremely low-income renters or have set-asides devoted to this population. Overall, funding for programs is entirely inadequate. The magnitude and the duration of need for assistance has just greatly outpaced the available funding. 30% of all programs are already closed. These programs had at least $1.2 billion devoted to them, meaning that at least 1/3 of the funding we're tracking has hopefully been committed. Over half of all these enacted programs used selection processes like first come, first served or lottery systems to disperse their funds, rather than being able to support all applicants that needed funding. And lastly, 82% of programs are designed for short-term relief of 3 months or less. And as we've seen thus far, COVID-19 and its economic fallout have already lasted for 7 months and unfortunately are likely to continue for longer. So as Andrew mentioned, we're doing other work and research related to rental assistance outside of this database. We've found that rental assistance program administrators have found new ways to be flexible and responsive during the pandemic, but really have to navigate difficult trade-offs, and we'd like to learn more about these issues. For example, intake assistance can improve tenants' access to rental assistance, even though it can strain administrative capacity. Applications can be really difficult for tenants to navigate. They might be written for advanced reading levels or contain unfamiliar jargon, and programs can help by providing one-on-one counseling over the phone or other creative and safe modes of oral communication to help tenants understand the application, as well as understand the documentation requirements. However, the time necessary for the service can really strain staff capacity and slow down the processing of applications. Fewer documentation requirements would really reduce application processing times and would help a lot more tenants apply, but some administrators feel they cannot reduce requirements. They may feel that current guidance around the documents required for the Department of Housing and Urban Development or for the Department of Treasury is unclear, and they may fear that future audits might find their programs out of compliance. And we're also really curious about concessions. So landlord concessions may help some tenants, but overly stringent concessions can also reduce landlord participation. So there's some sort of sweet spot there, it seems. So for example, some programs may ask landlords to agree to not evict tenants for a specified period of time, or to not raise rents for a specified period of time. And these concessions can really protect tenants' housing stability. However, overly stringent terms can limit landlords' willingness to participate. So for example, the second phase of Pennsylvania's rent relief program initially asked landlords to accept a monthly rental assistance payment of up to $750 per household as the full payment of rent, regardless of household size or location. Though the program covers up to 6 months of rent, the stringent terms of the program has deterred many landlords from participating, especially in higher cost areas, and have led to some changes in the program design in the past couple of weeks. These are just a few of the issues we'd like to explore, and we look forward to sharing more information as we learn more. So I'll stop there, but wanted to remind you that we'll be coming out with an updated research note this week, so watch out for it. And we will also be updating the database weekly, so check it out. I think that Kim shared the link in the chat, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca and Andrew. Outstanding. I just wanted to also encourage folks, I think Andrew may have done this earlier on, but if you know of a rental assistance program that you do not see in the database, please let us know. We do have a couple of comments / questions about not a lot of rural states have rental assistance programs, or they're not showing up, at least in the interactive map. And then the comment that a state like California, does it not have a state program because all of its programs are being administered locally, or is it budget related? I don't know if either of you want to make any comments about either of those questions.
Sure. I was waiting to see if Rebecca was. Did you want to answer that, Rebecca, or do you want me to?
I think that I don't really know that I would have the answer for California. I think that it would be better if somebody locally could speak to that. I'm also very curious, actually. And yeah, as for rural states, I think that there are a number of rural states that do not currently have statewide rental assistance programs, at least that we know of yet. And I think that might partially be that governors or the legislative branch hasn't really decided to commit their funding to rental assistance yet. And
Yeah, so the only thing I'll add to that is that the states we're seeing, I'm not sure what is going on with California in terms of why we don't yet have a state rental assistance program. But what we have seen among all of the other states is some of them are they're very centralized, where the eligibility criteria as well as the implementation of the program is very much done at the state level. But then there's other states, I think like Florida comes to mind and Oregon comes to mind, where it's a state program, but it is being administered by local, in Florida's case, local housing offices, SHIP offices, or at a regional nature by an organization. So different states are implementing it in different ways. And it will be interesting to see, what the benefits or weaknesses of both are, whether to have it highly centralized or highly decentralized. And we see that with eligibility criteria as well with the state program. Some states are very clear and say these are the criteria. Other states give some flexibility within the program for local offices who are administering the program to decide what some of the criteria are.
Great, thank you. Maybe just one more question, and that is, will we be able to draw out some best practices so that advocates on the ground will be able to say, here are what we consider to be the best practices for rental assistance programs?
yeah, I think that the research note will definitely have a couple of best practices, as well as a couple of things that we're seeing as potentially best practices, but also understanding a little bit of wanting to learn more. The points on one of the last slides that I had around some of these trade-offs, you know, I think that there is definitely a best practice there, but a lot of programs are in a tight corner and have had to rapidly adapt and are still rapidly adapting. And I think it's really difficult and challenging for everybody right now.
All right.
And the one thing
Go ahead.
I'll add to
Yeah.
that is our plan with the surveys we're doing of administrators of these programs, as well as we're going to do some further in-depth interviews with administrators of some of these programs to get a sense of, you know, like Rebecca was saying, some of the changes they've had to make to address some of the challenges and sort of to move towards some best practices.
All right, Andrew and Rebecca, thank you so much for that presentation and for answering those questions. There are others that have come in. If you could take a few minutes to respond to some of those, that'd be great. Thank you so much. Okay, now we're going to turn to the latest from Capitol Hill on the COVID-19 relief and disaster bills that Sarah Sadian can fill us in on. Sarah Sadian is the Vice President for Public Policy at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Paul. So negotiations are continuing over a relief package. We know that a lot of progress has been made, but we are running out of time to get a bill done before the election. Speaker Pelosi has set a deadline of tomorrow, end of business day, to determine whether or not a bill can be voted on before November 3rd. That's really a question about timing and not a question about whether or not an overall deal could be reached after the election. We do know that both House Democrats and the White House are much closer to an agreement than they have been over the last several months. There's still somewhat of a divide between the $2.2 trillion plan that the House put forward earlier this month. And now the White House is up to $1.8 trillion. So there's been a lot of progress made there, but there's still significant disagreements about key policy provisions. One, Democrats are still pushing for more state and local resources for fiscal relief. Republicans are still pushing for liability protections for businesses. We've also heard Democrats voice concern that the White House is not supporting language to ensure that testing resources are reaching communities of color who are disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. So there's still a lot of back and forth between the two sides in negotiating the bill. What's interesting here is that the White House's latest proposal, that $1.8 trillion, Democrats said didn't go far enough. But now we're starting to hear more and more voices, especially from Senate Republicans, who are saying that it's too expensive and that they don't want to vote on that. We should know more about the current state of negotiations today. We know that Pelosi and Mnuchin were speaking by phone at 3 o'clock. So we'll be paying close attention to seeing what the readout from that meeting is. As Jeff Stein from the Washington Post has said, at that point, either something could happen or something could not happen. So it's a little up in the air about what the path forward is right now. I did mention, though, that Senate Republicans are pushing back on that $1.8 trillion figure that the White House has offered to Speaker Pelosi. As part of that effort, Mitch McConnell is bringing forward a bill to vote on Wednesday. That would be a much smaller package. It's about $500 billion. It includes the resources for unemployment assistance, funding for schools, for testing, and new PPP loans for small businesses, but it does not include any emergency rental assistance. It doesn't include any resources for people experiencing homelessness or other housing resources. So it's deeply, deeply inadequate. The same proposal was, they wanted to bring it up for a vote earlier this year, and Senate Democrats blocked it. We expect the same thing will happen on Wednesday. But it is a really important opportunity for advocates to be reaching out to their senators, especially Republican senators, to tell them that any relief package has to include essential housing and homelessness resources. We also know that the Senate is going to be bringing up a bill tomorrow on a standalone PPP proposal. Again, we don't expect that bill to pass either, as Democrats are pushing for a much broader package and don't want to address this piecemeal. If a deal is not reached before the election, that means our efforts will be focused on the lame duck. We, as you heard from other folks on the call today, we need to make sure that there are emergency rental assistance resources and a national eviction moratorium in place for when the CDC moratorium expires. We really can't afford to have any sort of gap in protections for when a CDC moratorium might end on December 31st. And if there is a gap, that would allow for millions of renters to be at risk of losing their homes. And just as a reminder to folks, we estimate that between 30 and 40 million renters are at risk of losing their homes when the eviction moratorium expires at the end of the year. And in the meantime, especially small landlords who are relying on rental income might be struggling to pay their bills. So this issue is going to continue to get worse and worse the longer that it takes for Congress to pass something. But we'll be in touch with folks if we hear anything about a deal being reached or if there's an opportunity for a vote on a bill that might move forward. Thanks, Paul. Any questions?
Thanks, Sarah. I don't see any that have come in now. There was a question before the call began. Somebody saying by asking about whether the rent assistance checks that would be in the currently proposed HEROES Act, which is Pelosi's position, would be paid to the landlord on behalf of the renter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll share a link to our fact sheet in the chat box. But the emergency rental assistance plan that's in the HEROES Act and that Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer have been pushing is called the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act. It's a really long name, but it's S3685 or HR 6820. It provides $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. It's really flexibly designed, but essentially the funds would be provided directly to landlords, but on behalf of tenants. And that's a really important feature of this bill, where we would be concerned about money that would flow directly to landlords because we'd be worried about enforcement mechanisms to make sure that landlords aren't just accepting the funds, but still moving forward with evictions. I think we've seen some of the negative repercussions of providing too much flexibility to landlords under, for example, the CARES Act moratorium or the CDC moratorium. We are still seeing illegal evictions move forward. And so it'd be really important to make sure that the way we design this emergency rental assistance protects renters as much as possible. And so having a tenant-based approach is what we think is the best way to ensure that.
And somebody just asked the question, could you repeat the name, bill number for the emergency rental?
Yeah, the bill is called the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act. It was introduced by Senator Sherrod Brown and Representatives Maxine Waters and Denny Heck. The bill numbers are S3685 and HR 6820. Right now, it has the support of, I think, every Democratic senator, except for maybe one in the Senate, and about 165 House members. So this is really what Democrats have coalesced around as being the model for providing emergency rental assistance if there is a bill.
All right, fantastic, Sarah. Thank you so much. So just a couple of other things before we conclude. There was a question that came in before the call that asked, are we seeing significant decreases in rent payments paid by renters? And is there a place to see that by states? And I had shared in the chat that the National Multifamily Housing Council has a rent payment tracker. They have found a reduction of about 2.4% in rent payments. However, it's really important to note, and they do list it out by state, so you'll be able to find that information there. And I put it into the chat, the link for that. But the other thing to note is that, as you would expect, rent payments are much better coming from higher income folks that put people much further down the income scale, and basically based on the rental costs are, types of apartments that are paying rent on, the percentages of those not being able to pay their rent are much higher at the lower end of the apartment scale, let's call it.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
Actually, and I can also share a link in the chat box too. There was a good report from Bloomberg by a company called LeaseLock that looked at just Class C properties, which are properties that tend to be older and tend to serve lower income people. And they show that their rents slipped to 37% of total rents that were owed. So there's a huge disparity of impact on properties that are serving low-income people. So I'll share that in the chat box too.
Outstanding. Thank you very much. The other thing I just wanted to encourage everybody to please join NLIHC in the other calls that we conduct. So we have a number of working group calls. We have a legislative working group that meets on Tuesdays at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a working with FEMA group that meets every other Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. The next call is tomorrow. We have a state and local implementation working group that meets on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And then we have a tenant talk live for renters and resident leaders the first Monday of every month at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The next one is on November 2nd, election eve, on ensuring you can vote, avoiding voter intimidation and voter suppression. So please join us for those. And I'll just ask somebody from the NLIHC team to put the link in for going to those and registering for those working group calls. So I think that concludes our call for today. It's just a couple minutes before 4. Thank you everyone for participating, and to all of our presenters. Really appreciate it. Until next week, thank you.